The wind howled across the Arizona desert like a wild animal, carrying with it the bitter cold that seemed to cut right through a person's bones. It was February 1887, and the winter had been crueler than anyone could remember. Even the old-timers in Tucson were shaking their heads, saying they'd never seen anything like it. Margaret O'Sullivan pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of her small wooden cabin. The morning air hit her face like a slap, making her eyes water. She looked out at what remained of her ranch, if you could even call it that anymore. The fence posts stood crooked in the frozen ground, and half the rails had been used for firewood weeks ago. Her breath came out in small white clouds as she counted her cattle. 8. That's all that was left of the 30 head she and Patrick had started with just 2 years ago. Patrick, even thinking his name still made her chest tighten with pain. He'd been dead almost a year now, taken by the fever that swept through the territory last spring. One day he was fixing the roof, whistling that Irish tune his mother used to sing, and 3 days later she was standing over his grave with dirt under her fingernails from digging it herself. "Mama, I'm hungry." The small voice came from behind her. Little Molly stood in the doorway, her thin nightgown barely covering her skinny legs. At 6 years old, she'd already learned not to ask for much, but hunger was something that couldn't be ignored. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to find us something." Margaret forced a smile onto her face, the kind mothers learn to make when their hearts are breaking. "Why don't you wake up Billy and tell him to get dressed? We've got work to do." Billy was 8, old enough to understand their situation, but still young enough to believe his mama could fix anything. He'd been trying so hard to be the man of the house since Patrick died, carrying buckets that were too heavy for him and attempting to mend fences with his small hands. It broke Margaret's heart to watch him struggle, but she needed his help. Now, more than ever. The cabin felt even smaller in winter, with all 3 of them huddled around the tiny wood stove that barely kept the chill away. Margaret opened the cupboard and stared at their supplies. A handful of beans rattled in a jar. Some flour, maybe enough for 2 more days of thin bread, a small piece of salt pork that she'd been saving for an emergency. She laughed bitterly. To herself, if this wasn't an emergency, what was? "Mama, look." Billy pressed his face against the frosted window. Clover's shivering again. Margaret's heart sank as she looked out at their horse. Clover was a chestnut mare, 15 years old, and showing every one of those years. Her ribs were starting to show through her winter coat, and her head hung low as she stood near the barn. That horse was more than just an animal to the O'Sullivan family. She was their lifeline. Without Clover, Margaret couldn't get to town for supplies. She couldn't work the land. She couldn't do any of the 100 things that kept them alive. Out here in the middle of nowhere? "She needs grain," Margaret whispered to herself, knowing full well they didn't have any grain to give. They'd fed the last of it to the cattle 2 weeks ago, hoping to keep them alive through the worst of the winter. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret smoothed down her hair and opened it to find Jake Henderson, their nearest neighbor. Jake lived about 3 miles east with his wife Rose and their 4 children. He was a good man, the kind who'd share his last biscuit with you, but even good men had limits when times got hard. "Morning, Margaret." Jake's weathered face looked uncomfortable, like he was carrying bad news. "I hate to bother you, but I thought you should know there's been talk in town." "What kind of talk?" Margaret already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "About your place, about what's going to happen when spring comes." Jake shuffled his feet in the dirt. "The bank's been asking questions. Mr. Whitmore's been telling folks that Patrick owed more money than most people knew." Margaret felt the ground shift under her feet. She'd known there were debts. Patrick had borrowed money to buy their cattle and improve the land. But she'd hoped they were manageable. Hoped she could work something out when the situation got better. Much. "Are we talking about Jake? You're on $400, from what I heard?" Jake's voice was gentle, but the words hit Margaret like a physical blow. $400 might as well have been 4,000. She probably hadn't seen that much money all at once in her entire life. "I see." Margaret tried to keep her voice steady for the children's sake, but inside she felt like screaming. "Thank you for telling me." After Jake left, Margaret sat at their small wooden table and put her head in her hands. The arithmetic was simple and cruel. No money meant no way to pay the bank. No payment meant losing the ranch. Losing the ranch meant losing everything Patrick had worked and died for. It meant taking the children back east to live with her sister in Boston, crowded into a tiny apartment, dependent on charity and pity. But even worse than that was the immediate problem. They were running out of food and fast. The nearest town was a day's ride away, assuming the weather held and Clover could make the trip. But making the trip required money they didn't have to buy supplies they desperately needed. "Mama." Molly's voice was small and scared. She'd been listening, understanding more than a 6-year-old should have to. "Are we going to be okay?" Margaret pulled her daughter onto her lap and held her tight. Molly was so thin now, like a little bird that might blow away in the wind. Billy came over too, trying to act brave but needing comfort just as much as his sister. "We're going to figure this out," Margaret said, and she meant it. She'd been knocked down before when her parents died of the cholera back in Illinois. When she and Patrick had lost their first baby, when Patrick himself had been taken from them, each time she'd found a way to get back up. This wouldn't be any different. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat by the window and watched the stars. They were brighter out here than they'd ever been back east, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Patrick used to say that each star was watching over someone, keeping them safe through the night. She thought about the choices ahead of her. She could swallow her pride and ask Jake Henderson for help. But his family was barely making it through the winter themselves. She could try to sell Clover, but who had money for a horse these days? And without Clover, they were truly trapped. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding her how alone they were out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The town might as well have been on the moon. If something happened to one of the children, if they got sick or hurt, she wouldn't even be able to get help. But giving up wasn't in Margaret O'Sullivan's nature. Her grandmother back in County Cork used to say that the Irish were like weeds. They might get stepped on, but they always found a way to grow back stronger. Margaret held on to that thought as she finally went to bed, listening to the soft breathing of her children and planning for another day of survival. Outside, Clover stood shivering in the cold, and the 8 remaining cattle huddled together. For warmth, the harsh winter was far from over, and none of them knew that their greatest test was still ahead of them. 3 days had passed since Jake Henderson brought the terrible news about the bank debt. Margaret had barely slept, her mind racing with impossible solutions to their problems. The children were asking fewer questions now, sensing that their mother needed quiet to think. Even little Molly had stopped complaining about being hungry, which worried Margaret more than any crying would have. The morning started like any other. Margaret stepped outside to check on Clover and count the cattle, her daily ritual that had become both a chore and a prayer. Please let them all still be alive. Please let us make it through another day. The sun was just starting to peek over. The mountains, painting the desert in soft shades of pink and orange. It would have been beautiful if Margaret had the luxury of noticing such things. She was walking toward the well when she saw him. At first, she thought it was a pile of old clothes someone had dropped. But as she got closer, her heart started pounding. It was a man lying face down in the dirt about 20 feet from her well. He wasn't moving. Margaret's first instinct was to run back to the house and grab Patrick's old rifle. Everyone in the territory knew the stories about Apache. Raids about settlers found dead in their own yards. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the man's body was curled up, like he was trying to make himself as small as possible. Maybe it was the dark stain in the dirt around him that looked suspiciously like blood. "Hello," she called, out, her voice shaking. "Are you hurt?" No response. Margaret took a step closer, then another. The man was definitely an Apache. She could tell by his long black hair and the way he was dressed. But he was also clearly in trouble. His shirt was torn and soaked with blood, and his breathing was so shallow she could barely see his chest moving. Margaret looked back toward the house. Billy and Molly were still inside, probably wondering where she was. The smart thing to do would be to get them, saddle up Clover, and ride to the Henderson place. Let Jake deal with this. Let someone else make the hard decisions. But the man moaned softly, and Margaret found herself kneeling beside him instead. Can you hear me? She whispered. You're hurt pretty bad.
Ah,
She gently turned him over, and her breath caught in her throat. He had 2 bullet wounds, one in his shoulder and another in his side. The blood had dried and crusted around the holes, but they looked infected. His face was burning with fever, and his lips were cracked from thirst. Margaret had seen enough. Sick people to know this man was dying. Whatever had happened to him, wherever he'd come from, he wasn't going to last much longer without help. And help was something she was probably the only person for miles around who could provide. Mama? Billy's voice came from behind her. What's wrong? Margaret turned to see both her children standing there, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Molly was holding onto Billy's hand, ready to run if her mother told her to. There's a man here who's been hurt, Margaret said carefully. He needs help. Is he going to hurt us? Molly asked in a small voice. Margaret looked down at the unconscious. Apache, he was tall and probably strong when he was healthy, but right now he looked like a broken bird. No, sweetheart, he can't hurt anyone right now. Billy stepped closer, his 8-year-old curiosity overcoming his fear. What happened to him? Someone shot him, Margaret said. Maybe bounty hunters, maybe soldiers. Doesn't matter now. She made a decision that would change everything. Billy, I need you to help me get him to the barn. Molly, you run inside and get some clean rags in the medicine box. Mama, are you sure about this? Billy asked. Right. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He knew as well as anyone what it meant to help an Apache in this part of the territory. Sure, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure at all. Your father always said that when someone needs help, you help them. It doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. It took all 3 of them to drag the wounded man to the barn. He was heavier than he looked, and Margaret's back was screaming by the time they got him settled on a pile of old blankets. The children watched in fascination as she cleaned his wounds with water from the well and applied the last of their medicine. Precious supplies they couldn't afford to waste. For the next 2 days, Margaret barely left the barn. She spooned water into the man's mouth drop by drop, changed his bandages, and tried to bring down his fever with cool cloths. The children helped when they could, but mostly they just watched and whispered to each other about what might happen. Next, on the 3rd day, the Apache finally opened his eyes. Margaret was sitting beside him, sewing a hole in Billy's shirt by lamplight when she heard him stir. She looked down to find dark eyes staring at her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Easy, she said softly. You're safe. You were hurt, but you're going to be okay. The man tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a groan. He said something in his own language, then switched to broken English. Where, ... Where am I? You're at my ranch, Margaret said. About 15 miles west of Tucson. I found you by my well 3 days ago. You'd been shot. The Apache's eyes darted around the barn, taking in his surroundings. My horse, he said suddenly, trying to sit up again. Where is my horse? I don't know, Margaret said honestly. There was no horse when I found you. I'm sorry. The pain that crossed the man's face had nothing to do with his bullet wounds. Thunderwalker, he whispered. His name was Thunderwalker. It was ... He was everything. Margaret understood. She looked at Clover standing in her stall and knew exactly how this man felt. A horse wasn't just an animal out here. It was freedom, security, survival. Without Thunderwalker, this Apache was as trapped as she was. What's your name? Margaret asked gently. Nolnish, he said after a moment. It means he works in your language. I'm Margaret. Those are my children, Billy and Molly. She gestured toward the house. We've been taking care of you. Nolnish studied her face for a long moment. Why? He asked simply. It was a fair question. Margaret had been asking herself the same thing for 3 days. Why risk her children's safety for a stranger? Why use their precious medical supplies on someone who might have been raiding other ranches just days ago? Because you needed help, she said finally. And because it was the right thing to do. Nolnish closed his eyes and was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he'd fallen asleep again. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The bounty hunters, he said. They came at dawn, killed my horse first, then shot me, left me to die in the desert. He opened his eyes and looked at Margaret. He said dead Apache was worth $50. Didn't matter if I'd done anything wrong or not. Margaret felt sick. She'd heard about the bounty system. But hearing it from someone who'd lived through it made it real in a way that turned her stomach. Over the next few days, Nolnish grew stronger. He was able to sit up, then stand, then walk around the barn. Margaret learned that he was the son of a respected chief, that he had a wife and children waiting for him in the mountains, and that he'd been traveling alone when the bounty hunters found him. But she also learned something else. Despite getting better, Nolnish was still a man without a horse in country that could kill you if you tried to cross it on foot. The distance to his people was too far to walk, especially for someone still recovering from serious wounds. Margaret watched him stare out at the desert each evening, his face full of longing and desperation. She knew that look. She'd seen it in her own mirror every morning since Patrick died. It was the look of someone who was trapped, who could see what they needed but couldn't reach it. And slowly, an impossible idea began to form in her mind. It's an idea so crazy, so dangerous, that she tried to push it away every time it surfaced. But it kept coming back, stronger each time, until she couldn't ignore it anymore. The idea involved Clover. It's their last hope, their only connection to the outside world. The one thing standing between her family and complete disaster. Margaret stood in the barn doorway, watching Nolnish pace like a caged animal, realized she was about to make a decision that would either save them all or destroy them completely. The impossible idea had been growing in Margaret's mind for 2 days now, like a seed that refused to stop sprouting no matter how hard she tried to ignore it.
Ow.
Every time she looked at Nolnish pacing in the barn, every time she saw the desperate longing in his eyes as he stared toward the mountains, the idea got stronger. Give him Clover. It was insane. It was suicide. It was the kind of decision that would destroy her family's last chance at survival. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that it was also the right thing to do. She was stirring a thin soup made from the last of their beans when Billy came running into the house, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, come quick. Nolnish is talking about his family?" Margaret followed her son to the barn, where she found the Apache sitting on a bale of hay, Molly beside him listening with wide eyes. Despite everything the children had taken to Nolnish, he was gentle with them, patient with their questions, and had even carved little wooden animals for them to play with. "Tell Mama about your little girl," Molly said, tugging on Nolnish's sleeve. Nolnish looked up at Margaret, his dark eyes soft with memory. "Her name is Ayana. This means eternal blossom. She is 6 summers old, like your Molly." He smiled. "Sadly, she likes to collect pretty stones and make necklaces. Always asking her mother when I will come home." Margaret felt her heart clench. "And your wife, Tuha, she is. How do you say worried? When I do not return, she will think I am dead. The whole tribe will think I am dead." Nolnish's voice grew heavy. "They will mourn for me. My daughter will grow up believing her father abandoned her." Billy kicked at the dirt with his boot. "Can't you just walk home?" Nolnish shook his head. "Too far. 200 miles through desert and mountains, without a horse, without supplies." He gestured helplessly. "I would die before I reach them, and there are soldiers, bounty hunters. They shoot Apache on sight." Margaret watched the pain cross his face and felt something twist in her chest. This man wasn't just a stranger she'd helped. He was a father, a husband, someone with people depending on him, just like Patrick had been. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a pencil and paper, trying to work out their situation. The numbers were brutal and simple. They had food for maybe 3 more days. No money, no way to get to town for supplies. Winter was far from over, and the bank would come calling as soon as spring arrived. Without Clover, they were trapped. But with Clover, they had a fighting chance. Maybe she could get to town, find some kind of work, figure out a way to pay off at least part of the debt. Maybe she could sell some of their remaining cattle, if any of them survived the winter. But Nolnish without a horse was a dead man, and his family would never know what happened to him. Margaret stared at the paper, until the numbers blurred together. There had to be another way. There had to be something she was missing. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Margaret was feeding the cattle when she heard horses approaching. 3 men rode up to her house, their faces hard and their guns visible. She recognized the type immediately: bounty hunters, the kind of men who made their living tracking down Apache for the reward money. "Morning, ma'am," the leader said, tipping his hat. He was a thin man with cruel eyes and a scar across his left cheek. "Name's Garrett. We're looking for a wounded Apache. Tracked him this far before we lost the trail." Margaret's mouth went dry, but she kept her voice steady. "Haven't seen any Apache around here? You sure about that?" Garrett's eyes were suspicious. "This one was shot up pretty bad. Might have been looking for help." "I'm sure," Margaret said firmly. "Just me and my children out here." We'd have noticed an Apache. One of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with a tobacco-stained beard, spat in the dirt. "I want to search the place anyway, Garrett. These settler women sometimes help the savages out of some misguided Christian charity." Margaret felt anger flare in her chest. "You're welcome to look around, but you won't find anything. I'd appreciate it if you'd watch your language around my children." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "Check the barn and outbuildings, but be quick about it." Margaret's heart hammered as the men dismounted and began searching. In the barn, Nalnish was hidden under a pile of hay in the back stall, a hiding place they'd prepared for exactly this situation. Margaret had made him promise to stay completely still, no matter what he heard. The minutes felt like hours. Margaret stood in her yard, trying to look calm while inside she was screaming. If they found Nalnish, they'd kill him on the spot. And they might kill her and the children too, for harboring a fugitive. Finally, the men returned. "Nothing," the heavyset one reported. "It's just an old horse and some half-dead cattle." Garrett nodded, but his eyes remained suspicious. "If you do see anything, ma'am, there's a $50 reward, dead or alive." After they rode away, Margaret collapsed against the barn wall, her legs shaking. $50. More money than she'd seen in months, enough to buy food, supplies, maybe even make a payment to the bank. All she had to do was turn in a man who'd done nothing wrong except be born Apache. The thought made her sick. That evening, Nalnish sat with the family at their small table, sharing their meager supper. He'd grown stronger over the past week, but Margaret could see the desperation in his eyes growing too. He knew as well as she did that time was running out. "The spring raids will begin soon," he said quietly. "My people will think I am dead. They will choose a new war leader, without me there to speak for peace. ... He shook his head. "There will be much blood." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. Nalnish looked at her sadly. "I am what you call a peace chief. I speak for those who want to live in harmony with the white settlers. But there are others who believe only war will save our people. Without my voice, they will prevail." Margaret felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just about one man getting home to his family. It was about preventing a war that could cost hundreds of lives on both sides. After the children went to bed, Margaret walked out to the barn and stood beside Clover. The old mare nuzzled her hand, looking for treats Margaret didn't have to give. Clover had been with their family for 8 years. She'd carried Patrick to town when he was courting Margaret. She'd helped pull their wagon when they first came to Arizona. She'd been there for every important moment of their lives. What would Patrick do? Margaret whispered to the horse, but she already knew the answer. Patrick had always said that doing the right thing wasn't about what was easy or safe. It was about what you could live with afterward. And Margaret knew she couldn't live with herself if she let Nalnish die when she had the power to save him. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She dressed quietly and walked to the barn, where Nalnish was already awake, staring out at the lightning sky. Simply Nalnish looked at her, confused. Time for what? Margaret walked to Clover's stall and began saddling the mare. Her hands shook as she tightened the straps, but her voice was steady. "Time for you to go home. I don't understand. I'm taking Clover." Margaret's voice broke slightly on the words. "She's old, but she's strong. She can get you to your people." Nalnish stared at her in shock. "No, I cannot take your horse. You need her. You need her more, Margaret finished, with the saddle and turned to face him. Your family needs you. Your people need you. And maybe if you can prevent a war, a lot of other families will keep their fathers and sons. But what about you? What about your children? Margaret had been asking herself the same question all night. The answer was terrifying, but it was also clear. We'll figure something out. We always do. Nolnish's eyes filled with tears. This is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. But I cannot accept it, not when it means your family will suffer. Yes, you can, Margaret said firmly, and you will, because that's what people do for each other. They help when help is needed, even when it costs them everything. She led Clover out of the barn and helped Nolnish mount. The Apache sat straight, in the saddle, looking more like the chief's son he was than the broken man she'd found by her well. I will not forget this, he said solemnly. My people have a saying, a debt of life can only be repaid with life. I owe you everything. Margaret handed him a small bag containing the last of their food and her husband's canteen. Just get home safe. That's all the payment I need. As Nolnish rode away, heading toward the mountains where his family waited, Margaret stood in her yard and watched until he disappeared from sight. Behind her, the children were still sleeping, unaware that their last hope of survival had just ridden away on 4 legs. But as scared as Margaret was, she also felt something she hadn't experienced. In months, peace. She'd made an impossible choice, and somehow, it felt like the right one. Whatever happened next, she could face it knowing she'd acted with honor and compassion. The sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. It was going to be another hard day, but Margaret O'Sullivan was ready for it. The first week after Clover was gone felt like the longest 7 days of Margaret's life. She tried to keep busy, tried to maintain some sense of normalcy for the children. But everything they did reminded her of what they'd lost. The empty barn felt like a tomb. The silence where Clover's gentle nickering used to be was deafening. Billy was the first to truly understand what had happened. On the 3rd day, he came to Margaret with tears in his eyes. Mama, how are we going to get food? Now, Margaret had been dreading this question, but she prepared an answer. We're going to make do with what we have, son. And when spring comes, we'll figure out something else. But Billy was 8 years old, not stupid. There is no something else, is there? Without Clover, we can't get anywhere. What? Margaret pulled him close, feeling his thin shoulders shake. We'll manage. We always do. But even as she said the words, Margaret knew how hollow they sounded. The brutal truth was simple. Without a horse, they were trapped. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, too far to walk regularly, especially with 2 small children. The town was 15 miles, an impossible distance on foot. Molly took longer to understand. But when she did, the realization hit her hard. She'd always been a cheerful child, full of questions and laughter. But as the days passed and the food grew scarcer, she became quiet and withdrawn. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the empty corral where Clover used to graze. Is Clover coming back? She asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's heart broke. No, sweetheart, she's helping someone else now. Someone who needed her very much, more than we needed her. Margaret didn't know how to answer that question, because the truth was, they had needed Clover desperately. Now they were paying the price for her moment of compassion. The food situation grew critical fast. Margaret had thought they had enough beans and flour for maybe a week, but with careful rationing, she stretched it to 10 days. The children were constantly hungry. Now, their cheeks growing hollow and their clothes hanging loose. Margaret gave them most of her own portions, telling them she wasn't hungry when her stomach felt like it was eating itself. On the 11th day, Jake Henderson rode up to their cabin. Margaret saw him coming from the window and felt a mixture of relief and shame. Relief because Jake might have news or help. Shame because she knew how their situation must look. Margaret, Jake said, as he dismounted, his face grim. We need to talk. Margaret invited him inside, but there wasn't much to offer. No coffee, no food to share, just the stark reality of their situation laid bare. Jake looked around the cabin, taking in the empty shelves and the children's gaunt faces. "Where's Clover?" he asked directly. Margaret had prepared for this question too. "She's gone." "Gone where?" "Did someone steal her?" "No." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I gave her away." Jake stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You gave away your horse, Margaret? That horse was your lifeline. Without her, you're looked." He looked at the children and lowered his voice. "You're going to die out here." "We'll manage," Margaret said again, the words feeling more meaningless each time she spoke them. Jake shook his head in disbelief. "To who? Who did you give her to?" Margaret hesitated. Jake was a good man, but he was also a practical one. She told him about Nalnish. He might feel obligated to report it to the authorities. "Someone who needed her more than we did. Nobody needed that horse more than you did." Jake's voice rose, then he caught himself and glanced at the children. "Margaret, I heard something in town yesterday. The bank's getting impatient. Mr. Whitmore's been asking questions about your place. About whether you can make any kind of payment." Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival that she'd almost forgotten about the larger threat hanging over them. What kind of questions? About the value of the land. About what they could sell it for. Jake's expression was grim. "He's planning to foreclose as soon as the weather breaks. Maybe sooner." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Even if they somehow survived the winter, they were going to lose everything anyway. Patrick's dream, their home, their future, all of it would be gone. That night, after Jake left with promises to check on them again soon, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and tried to think. But every solution she came up with required money they didn't have, or transportation they'd given away. They were trapped in a situation with no good options. The second week was worse than the first. Margaret found herself rationing their remaining food so carefully that each meal consisted of little more than thin broth with a few beans floating in it. The children stopped complaining about being hungry, not because they weren't, but because they could see the desperation in their mothers' eyes. Billy started setting snares for rabbits, something Jake had taught him the previous summer. He was surprisingly good at it, and the occasional rabbit made the difference between having something to eat and having nothing at all. But rabbits were scarce in winter, and Billy's small traps couldn't solve their bigger problem. Molly took on the job of collecting firewood, wandering farther and farther from the house each day in search of anything that would burn. Margaret worried about her being alone, but they needed the fuel to stay warm. The dessert could be dangerous, but freezing to death in their own cabin was a more immediate threat. Margaret herself spent her days trying to keep their remaining cattle alive, though she was fighting a losing battle. They were down to 6 head. Now, and those were so thin, they probably wouldn't survive much longer. Each morning, she expected to find another one dead in the dirt. The third week brought new challenges. A severe storm rolled in from the west, dumping 6 inches of snow and bringing temperatures that made their previous cold snaps seem mild. Margaret huddled with the children around their small stove, burning furniture when they ran out of wood, trying to keep everyone warm enough to survive the night. It was during this storm that Rose Henderson showed up at their door. Margaret opened. It defined Jake's wife standing on her step with a basket covered by a cloth. Rose was a practical woman, not given to sentiment, but her face was soft with concern. "I brought some things," Rose said simply, pushing past Margaret into the warm cabin. The basket contained treasures beyond imagination: a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of preserved peaches, some dried meat, and a small bag of coffee beans. To Margaret's family, it might as well have been a feast fit for kings. "Rose, I can't accept this," Margaret said, though her children were already staring at the food with hungry eyes. "Yes, you can," Rose replied firmly, "and you will. Jake told me about your situation." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "Also told me you gave away your horse. I won't pretend to understand why you did such a thing, but I know you must have had your reasons." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Rose said. "This is just a bandage on a bigger wound. Jake and I talked about it, and we want to help, but we can't support 2 families through the winter. We've got our own children to think about." Margaret nodded, understanding completely. The Hendersons were good people, but they weren't rich. They had their own struggles, their own mouths to feed. "What I can do," Rose continued, "is bring you supplies when I can spare them. And when spring comes, we'll help you figure out what to do next." After Rose left, Margaret and the children shared their first real meal in days. The bread was soft and warm, the peaches sweet beyond belief. For a few hours it felt like everything might be okay. But that night, as Margaret lay awake listening to the wind howl around their cabin, she couldn't escape the brutal arithmetic of their situation. Even with the Hendersons' help, they were living on borrowed time. The bank was coming, spring was coming, and when it did, they'd be forced to face the consequences of every decision that had brought them to this point. Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered if she'd made the right choice in giving Clover to Nalnish. Her rational mind said no. She'd doomed her family to save a stranger. But her heart said something different. Her heart said that some things were more important than survival. Some things were worth sacrificing for. She just hoped that when the final reckoning came, her children would understand why their mother had chosen compassion over security. And maybe, just maybe, that choice would somehow be rewarded. But as the storm raged outside and her children slept fitfully beside her, that hope felt very far away indeed. 3 weeks had passed since Clover disappeared into the desert with Nalnish on her back. 21 days of wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. 21 nights of lying awake, listening to her children's hungry stomachs. Growling in the darkness, March 15th started like every other morning had for the past month, cold. Gray and filled with the kind of quiet desperation that had become Margaret's constant companion. She pulled on her worn boots and wrapped Patrick's old coat around her shoulders, steeling herself for another day of rationing, their dwindling supplies, and praying for a miracle she was sure would never come. The last of Rose, Henderson's food, had run out 2 days ago. They were back to thin soup made from whatever Billy could catch in his snares and whatever edible plants Molly could find that hadn't been killed by the frost. Margaret had even started eyeing their remaining cattle, wondering if she could somehow butcher one of them without proper tools or experience. She stepped outside to begin her morning routine, checking on the animals, counting what was left, trying to make their meager resources stretch just one more day. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor. It was going to be another beautiful day in a place that was slowly killing them. Margaret was halfway to the well when she heard it. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, without a cloud in sight. The sound came again, a low rumbling that seemed to be getting closer. Margaret's heart started racing. She'd heard that sound before, but never quite like this. It was the sound of horses running. Lots of them, coming fast across the desert. Her first thought was soldiers, or maybe more bounty hunters. Her second thought was to run back to the house and get the children to safety. But something made her stop and look toward the eastern horizon. Where the sound was coming from, what she saw made her wonder if hunger and stress had finally driven her completely mad. A line of horses appeared over a low ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky. But these weren't the tired, broken-down horses of soldiers or bounty hunters. These were magnificent animals, wild stallions, flowing manes, and powerful bodies that moved like poetry across the landscape. And leading them, sitting tall in a familiar saddle, was a figure she recognized. Nashli. Margaret's knees went weak. She grabbed the well's edge to steady herself, sure she was hallucinating. But the sound of hoofbeats got louder, and the sight became more real with each passing second. It was really him riding Clover and leading what looked like 20 of Sixons, the most beautiful horses she'd ever seen. "Mama," Billy's voice came from behind her. "Mama, what's that sound?" Margaret turned to see both her children standing in the doorway, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "Okay." Though she was starting to have an impossible hope. The horses swept into her yard like a living river, their hooves thundering against the hard ground. They were wild mustangs, Margaret realized, the kind of horses that roamed the desert in herds, free and untamed. Their coats gleamed in the morning sun, deep browns and blacks, chestnuts and grays, some with white markings that looked like they'd been painted by an artist. Nalnish dismounted from Clover and walked toward Margaret. He looked different than he had 3 weeks ago, stronger, healthier, but also somehow more dignified. He wore traditional Apache clothing now instead of the torn shirt he'd been found in, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of authority and respect. Behind him came 3 other Apache warriors, all mounted on their own horses, all watching Margaret with expressions she couldn't quite read. "You came back," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nalnish smiled, and Margaret saw genuine warmth in his dark eyes. "I told you that a debt of life can only be repaid with life. You saved mine, now I save yours." He gestured toward the magnificent herd that was now milling around Margaret's property, snorting and pawing at the ground. "These horses are for you, payment for the gift you gave me." Margaret stared at him in shock. "I can't. These are wild horses. They're not yours to give." "They are mine by right of capture," Nalnish said simply. "My people have ways of taking horses from the wild herds. It is a skill passed down from father to son." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But more than that, you have earned them. When I told my people what you did, how you gave your only horse to save a stranger's life, they were amazed. My father, the chief, said he had never heard of such generosity from a white person." One of the other Apache warriors rode closer and said something in their language. Nalnish nodded and turned back to Margaret. "This is my brother Tokoda. He says to tell you that these horses will make you wealthy beyond anything you could imagine. Each one is worth more than most men see in a year." Margaret's mind was reeling. She looked at the horses, really looked at them, and began to understand what Nalnish was telling her. These weren't just any horses. These were prime breeding stock, the kind of animals that rich ranchers would pay enormous sums to own. A single one of these stallions could be worth $100 or more. 20 of them, ... "This is too much," Margaret said, shaking her head. "I gave you one old horse. You're trying to give me a fortune." Nalnish's expression grew solemn. "You gave me everything you had to give, your family's only hope of survival. That deserves to be repaid with everything I have to give." Billy and Molly had crept closer during this conversation, staring at the horses with the kind of wonder that only children can manage. One of the younger stallions, a beautiful chestnut with a white blaze, had wandered over to investigate them. Billy reached out tentatively to touch the horse's nose. "They're so beautiful," Molly whispered. "Yes, they are," Nalnish agreed. "And they are yours now. Your mother's kindness has made your family rich." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. For weeks, she'd been telling herself that giving away Clover had been the right thing to do, but part of her had always wondered if she'd doomed her children for the sake of a stranger. Now, seeing the impossible gift that had just thundered into her yard, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked. Nalnish smiled. "Clover knew the way home. She is a smart horse, that one. She'll let us straight here." Margaret looked around for Clover and spotted her standing near the barn, looking pleased with herself. The old mare seemed to understand that she'd played a part in something important. "There is something else you should know," Nalnish said, his tone growing more serious. "When I returned to my people and told them what had happened, it changed things. The war party that was forming, the raids that were planned, they had been called off." "What do you mean?" "My father said that if there are white people like you in this territory, people who would risk everything to help a stranger, then perhaps there is hope for peace between our peoples. Your kindness may have saved many lives on both sides." Margaret felt overwhelmed. She'd thought she was just helping one man get home to his family. She'd never imagined that her choice could have consequences far beyond her own little ranch. The other Apache warriors were preparing to leave. They spoke briefly, with Nalnish in their own language, then mounted their horses. Tokoda rode over to Margaret and said something to her in Apache, then translated into English. "He says you have the heart of a true warrior," Nalnish explained, "and that your children will grow up to be strong because their mother taught them what honor looks like." As the warriors prepared to ride away, Nolnish turned to Margaret one last time. These horses will solve your money problems. They will pay your debts and make your family secure. But more than that, they are a symbol. They represent what can happen when people choose kindness over fear, generosity over selfishness. He mounted his own horse and looked down at Margaret. And her children? I will not forget what you did. None of my people will forget. If you ever need help, for any reason, you have friends in the Apache Nation. With that, the four warriors rode away, disappearing over the same ridge they'd appeared from. They left behind a silence that was very different from the desperate quiet Margaret had grown used to. This was the silence of possibility, of hope, a future that had suddenly become bright with promise. Margaret stood in her yard, surrounded by 20 magnificent horses and her 2 amazed children, and realized that sometimes the impossible really does happen. Sometimes kindness is rewarded in ways beyond imagination. Sometimes giving away everything you have is exactly what you need to do to get everything you need. The sun climbed higher into the desert sky, warming the air and painting everything in shades of gold. It was going to be a beautiful day, and for the first time in months, Margaret O'Sullivan could hardly wait to see what it would bring.